The carriage wheel cracked against a stone, and Elinor Winters felt her whole body jolt forward as the vehicle tipped hard to one side. For a moment, she thought they would roll into the ditch below. She grabbed the leather strap above her head and held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the driver could hear it. The horses screamed and reared, and the carriage shuddered to a stop at a terrible angle, half in the road and half sliding toward the muddy slope beside it. "Are you hurt, my lady?" the driver called out, his voice shaking. Elinor pressed a hand to her chest and forced herself to breathe. "I am well, but we cannot stay like this. The wheel will give way." She was right. Even as she spoke, she heard the wood groan beneath her, and she scrambled toward the door before the entire carriage could tip over. She had barely stepped down onto the muddy road when the wheel finally snapped completely, and the carriage crashed sideways into the ditch with a sound like a falling tree. Elinor stumbled back, her gloved hands flying to her mouth. Had she stayed inside one more second, she might have been badly hurt. It was in that moment of shock, standing alone on a darkening country road with her ruined carriage behind her, that she heard the sound of approaching horses. She turned quickly, half afraid it might be strangers with bad intentions. The roads outside London were not always safe after dusk, and her father's warnings echoed in her mind. But instead of rough men, she saw a single rider approaching at a controlled, powerful pace, his dark coat moving with the wind, his face still hidden beneath the shadow of dusk. When he drew close enough for her to see him clearly, she felt something she could not quite name. He was tall even on horseback, broad through the shoulders, with a face that looked as though it had been carved rather than born, all sharp lines and quiet intensity. There was nothing soft about him. Even the way he sat his horse suggested control, discipline, and a kind of contained power that made the air around him feel different. "Are you injured?" His voice was low, direct, without the polite flourishes most gentlemen used with strangers. "No," Elinor said, straightening her spine and trying to sound braver than she felt. "My carriage wheel broke. My driver and I are stranded." The stranger dismounted in one smooth motion and walked to the wrecked carriage without hesitation, inspecting the damage with the practical eye of a man who had seen far worse than a broken wheel. "This will not be repaired tonight," he said. "You cannot remain out here in the dark. There are travelers on this road who are not as harmless as I am." Elinor almost smiled at that, though nothing about the situation was funny. There was something about him that did not feel harmless at all, and yet, strangely, she did not feel afraid of him. She felt something closer to curiosity, and beneath that, a flicker of interest she had not expected to feel toward a stranger on a dark road. "I do not even know your name, sir," she said carefully. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time. "Gideon Ashcroft," he said, "Duke of Ravenswood." Elinor's breath caught. She had heard that name before, though she had never met the man attached to it. Everyone in London had heard of the Duke of Ravenswood. He was spoken of in hushed, uncertain tones, a man who had spent years leading soldiers through difficult campaigns abroad, a man rumored to be as cold and unreachable in his personal life as he reportedly was in command. Mothers warned their daughters away from him, not because he was dangerous to their safety, but because he was dangerous to their hearts. He never lingered. He never courted. He simply existed at the edge of society, distant and unreadable, until he vanished again for months at a time. And now he stood before her on a dark road, offering to help her. "I am Elinor Winters," she said, "daughter of the Earl of Camden." Something shifted in his expression, so brief she almost missed it. "Camden," he repeated, as though testing the name. "I know your father slightly. We have crossed paths at Parliament." "Then you understand I cannot simply accept a ride from a stranger, even a titled one," Elinor said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew she had little choice. The night was growing darker, the wind colder, and her driver was already occupied trying to calm the frightened horses. "You may walk if you prefer," Gideon said, and for one unsettling moment, Elinor thought he was teasing her. Then she caught the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "Though I would not recommend it. It is nearly 2 miles to the nearest inn, and the fog is settling." Elinor glanced at the fog rolling in low over the fields, thick and pale, swallowing the horizon. She thought of her father waiting for her at home, expecting her return from her visit to her aunt's estate. She thought of the trouble of remaining stranded, and the greater trouble, perhaps, of trusting a man with such a serious reputation. But something in his eyes, steady and unwavering, made her decide. "Very well," she said. "I will accept your escort to the nearest inn where I can send word to my father." Gideon nodded once, as though the matter were settled and required no further discussion. He instructed her driver to remain with the carriage and guard what belongings could be gathered, promising to send help back from the inn. Then he helped Elinor onto his horse before mounting behind her, his arm coming around her waist to steady her against the motion of the animal. Elinor stiffened at the contact, unused to such closeness with a man she had only just met. But there was nothing improper in the way he held her, nothing that suggested anything beyond simple practicality. And yet she was acutely aware of him, of the warmth radiating from him despite the cold evening air, of the steady rhythm of his breathing behind her. They rode in silence for a while, the horses' hooves muffled by the damp earth, the fog curling around them like something alive. Elinor found herself studying his hands where they held the reins, strong and marked, hands that had clearly done more than sign documents and shake other gentlemen's hands at balls. "You are wondering about the marks on my hands," Gideon said suddenly, and Elinor startled, realizing she had been staring. "I apologize, that was rude of me." "It was honest," he said. "Most people pretend not to notice. I find that more tiresome than curiosity." "Then may I ask?" "You may ask. I may choose not to answer." Elinor smiled slightly despite herself. There was something refreshing about his bluntness, something that stood apart from the careful, practiced conversations she was used to at London gatherings, where every word was weighed and measured before it was spoken. "How long were you away?" she asked instead. 6 years, he said. "Longer than I intended. Long journeys have a way of extending themselves beyond anyone's plans." "And now you have returned for good." "For now," he said, and something in his tone told her not to press further. They reached the inn just as full darkness settled over the countryside, the windows glowing warm and yellow against the encroaching night. Gideon helped her down from the horse, his hands steady at her waist, and for a brief moment, standing so close to him, Elinor felt something she had never quite felt before. It was not fear, though perhaps it should have been, given everything she had heard about him. It was something closer to awareness, a kind of quiet attention that made her far too conscious of every small movement between them. "Thank you," she said, stepping back before the moment could stretch any longer. "For your assistance tonight, I am in your debt." "You owe me nothing," Gideon said. "Though I confess I am curious, Lady Elinor, whether we shall meet again under calmer circumstances." Elinor considered her answer carefully, aware that word of tonight's encounter would spread through London society faster than she could control it, whether she wished it to or not. "I imagine our paths may cross again, Your Grace. London society is smaller than it appears." "Indeed it is," he said, and there was something in his eyes, some quiet certainty, that made Elinor wonder if he already knew something she did not. What she did not yet know was that her engagement, arranged months ago and considered settled by both families, was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. She did not yet know that the man who had just helped her on a dark and lonely road was about to become the greatest challenge of all, not to her safety, but to the careful, ordered life she had always believed she wanted. As she watched him ride away into the fog, his broad shoulders soon swallowed by the mist, Elinor felt an unfamiliar tug in her chest, a feeling she quickly tried to dismiss as nothing more than the lingering shock of the evening's events. She was wrong. Inside the inn, as she waited for word to reach her father, Elinor could not stop thinking about the intensity in Gideon Ashcroft's eyes, the quiet strength in his voice, the strange sense that beneath his cold reputation lay something far more complicated than the gossip suggested. She told herself it did not matter. She was promised to another man, a match arranged for the benefit of both their families, a future already decided long before tonight. But as the innkeeper's wife brought her tea and a blanket for her shoulders, Elinor found herself staring out the window into the fog, wondering when, and how, she might see the Duke of Ravenswood again. She did not have to wonder for long. 3 days later, Elinor stood in the ballroom of Camden House, surrounded by the glittering chaos of her own engagement celebration, and felt as though she could not breathe. The candles burned too bright, the music played too loud. And her betrothed, Lord Edmund Caro, stood beside her with his hand resting possessively on her arm, speaking to a circle of gentlemen about matters that did not interest her in the slightest, while barely glancing in her direction. She had known Edmund for 2 years, ever since their fathers had first discussed the arrangement over brandy and old family debts. He was handsome enough, respected enough, wealthy enough. He was, by every measure society used to judge a man, an excellent match. And yet standing beside him now, Elinor felt nothing but a strange, hollow tiredness, as though she were watching her own life from a great distance. "You are quiet tonight," Edmund said, finally turning to her, though his eyes moved past her shoulder even as he spoke, scanning the room for more important company. "I trust you are well." "I am well," Elinor said, though the words felt automatic, rehearsed 100 times before. "Good. Your father tells me the wedding preparations are progressing nicely. I confess I am eager for the matter to be settled." He said it the way a man might speak of settling a business contract, and Elinor felt a small, cold weight press against her chest. It was then that the room seemed to shift. She noticed it before she understood why. A subtle change in the noise level, a ripple of attention moving through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Heads turned toward the entrance, and whispers followed close behind. Elinor turned as well, and her heart stopped. Gideon Ashcroft stood at the top of the stairs leading into the ballroom, dressed in dark formal clothing that made him look even more severe than he had on the country road, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the room below him. He had not been on the guest list. Everyone knew he had not been on the guest list, because the Duke of Ravenswood rarely attended social gatherings at all, and certainly never uninvited ones. And yet here he was. Elinor's father, Charles Winters, Earl of Camden, moved through the crowd with unusual speed, his face a mixture of confusion and poorly hidden excitement. A duke, even an uninvited one, was not a guest to be turned away, especially not one whose family connections and fortune could benefit the Camden name considerably. "Your Grace," Charles said, bowing slightly as he reached the top of the stairs. "This is an unexpected honor. I was not aware you had returned to society." "I have not as a rule," Gideon said, his gaze sweeping briefly over the crowd before settling, for just a moment, on Elinor across the room. "But I found myself in need of allies for a certain venture, and your name was mentioned favorably. I hoped we might speak." Charles's eyes lit up with the particular gleam of a man who smelled opportunity. Of course, please join us. We are celebrating my daughter's engagement this evening, but there is always time for business between gentlemen." Elinor watched the exchange with a growing sense of unease, though she could not have said exactly why. Gideon Ashcroft did not seem like a man who did anything without careful purpose, and she found it very difficult to believe that his sudden appearance at her engagement celebration, of all events, was purely coincidental. He crossed the room with the same controlled, powerful stride she remembered from the dark road 3 nights before, and when he finally stood before her, bowing slightly over her offered hand, she felt that same strange awareness settle over her skin. "Lady Elinor," he said, "I trust your carriage has been repaired." "It has, thank you," she said, aware of Edmund watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. "May I present my betrothed, Lord Edmund Caro?" Gideon turned to Edmund with a polite but distant nod, and Elinor watched something pass between the two men, a kind of silent assessment that reminded her uncomfortably of 2 wolves measuring each other before deciding whether to fight. "Caro," Gideon said simply. "Ravenswood," Edmund replied, his tone carrying the faintest edge of challenge. I did not realize you were acquainted with my betrothed. We met by chance a few nights ago, Gideon said. Her carriage suffered a mishap on the road from her aunt's estate. I was fortunate enough to be nearby. How fortunate indeed, Edmund said, though his smile did not reach his eyes. The tension between the two men was palpable, and Elinor found herself searching for some way to ease it, though she was not entirely certain why it mattered so much to her. Before she could speak, her father returned, practically beaming, with a glass of wine already in hand for their unexpected guest. Your Grace, you mentioned a venture requiring allies, Charles said. I confess my curiosity is quite piqued. I have recently returned from an extended campaign, Gideon said smoothly. During my time away, I acquired certain interests in shipping and trade that require careful management here in England. I find myself in need of a partner with strong standing in Parliament and reliable connections among the merchant houses. Your reputation, Lord Camden, suggested you might be precisely the man I require. Elinor watched her father practically glow with pride at the compliment, and she understood, with a sinking feeling, exactly what was happening. Gideon Ashcroft was not simply a man seeking a business partner. He was a man who had walked into her engagement celebration, and within minutes, secured himself a foothold in her family's affairs, using nothing but calm words and the promise of profit. I would be honored to discuss such an arrangement further, Charles said eagerly. Perhaps you would do us the courtesy of visiting Camden House properly, so that we might speak at length. I would welcome that, Gideon said, and though his tone remained perfectly measured, his eyes flicked briefly to Elinor once more, and she understood with sudden and unsettling clarity that his business proposal was not entirely about business at all. Edmund, sensing the shift in attention, stepped closer to Elinor and placed his hand more firmly on her arm, an unmistakable gesture of ownership that made her stomach tighten unpleasantly. Perhaps another evening would be more appropriate for such discussions, he said. Tonight is meant to celebrate my engagement to Lady Elinor. Of course, Gideon said, inclining his head, forgive my intrusion. I did not mean to distract from the celebration. But as he stepped back, his gaze met Elinor's one final time, and in that brief moment, she saw something in his expression that unsettled her far more than anything he had said aloud. It was not the look of a man withdrawing. It was the look of a man simply choosing to wait. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles, but Elinor found her attention repeatedly drawn to the far side of the ballroom, where Gideon remained for nearly an hour longer, speaking with various gentlemen, always polite, always composed, and yet somehow always aware of exactly where she was standing. It was not until the following week that she understood the full scope of what he had set in motion. Her father arrived at breakfast one morning with an expression of barely contained triumph, waving a letter in his hand as though it contained news of a great victory. The Duke of Ravenswood has proposed the most extraordinary arrangement, he announced to the table, where Elinor sat quietly with her tea, and her mother, Lady Camden, looked up with polite interest. What sort of arrangement, dear? Her mother asked. He wishes to establish his shipping operations under joint management with our family, using Camden House as a base for meetings and correspondence while the details are finalized. He has offered extremely generous terms, and given his current lack of a permanent residence in London while his own estate undergoes renovations, he has asked whether he might take rooms here temporarily, purely as a matter of convenience during the negotiations. Elinor's teacup froze halfway to her lips. He wishes to stay here, she asked, more sharply than she intended. Her father glanced at her, slightly puzzled by her tone. Only for a short while, my dear, while the business details are arranged. It is not uncommon among gentlemen conducting significant financial matters, and given his rank and fortune, I would be a fool to refuse such an opportunity merely for the sake of appearances. But surely there are more suitable arrangements, Elinor pressed. A meeting room in the city, perhaps, or correspondence through solicitors. Elinor, her father said, a note of warning entering his voice. This is a matter of family business, not something requiring your opinion. The Duke of Ravenswood is a powerful and wealthy man, and his continued goodwill could benefit this family for generations. I have already sent my acceptance." Elinor set down her teacup carefully, aware of her mother watching her with quiet curiosity, and aware, too, of the strange, conflicting storm rising in her own chest. Part of her, the sensible part that understood duty and propriety and the careful arrangement of her entire future, knew that she should be alarmed by this development. A man like Gideon Ashcroft, taking up residence in her own home while she remained engaged to another, was precisely the sort of situation that could ruin a young woman's reputation entirely. But another part of her, a part she barely recognized and did not entirely trust, felt something dangerously close to anticipation. That evening, as the household prepared for the Duke's arrival the following day, Elinor found herself standing at her bedroom window, looking out over the darkened gardens below, thinking of dark roads and steady hands and eyes that seemed to see far more than they let on. She told herself firmly and repeatedly that this arrangement changed nothing. She was still promised to Edmund Caro. Her future was still decided. The Duke of Ravenswood was simply a business associate of her father's, nothing more, and his presence in her home would be brief and purely professional. She told herself this many times that night, and she almost believed it. But when she finally fell asleep, her dreams were not filled with images of Edmund Caro's polite, distant smile. They were filled with dark roads, thick fog, and the steady, unwavering gaze of a man who had looked at her as though he already knew exactly how this story would end. The following afternoon, a carriage bearing the Ravenswood crest arrived at Camden House, and Elinor watched from the drawing-room window as Gideon Ashcroft stepped down onto the gravel drive, his expression as composed and unreadable as always, though his eyes lifted almost immediately to the window where she stood. Whatever careful order she had built around her life, whatever comfortable certainty she had constructed regarding her future with Edmund Caro, was about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. The wolf had not simply approached her door. He had walked directly inside it. The days that followed brought a strange new rhythm to Camden House, one that Elinor found herself both dreading and, to her private shame, looking forward to each morning. Gideon Ashcroft kept mostly to the study her father had arranged for him, poring over shipping manifests and trade agreements with an intensity that suggested he took his supposed business venture far more seriously than Elinor had expected. And yet somehow, their paths crossed constantly, in the corridors, in the gardens, in the quiet hours of the evening when the rest of the household had retired. It began, as these things often do, with something small. Elinor had taken to reading in the library each afternoon, a habit her mother tolerated and her father barely noticed, since it kept her occupied and out of trouble while wedding preparations consumed most of the household's attention. She had settled into her favorite chair near the tall windows one afternoon, a book of poetry open on her lap, when she realized she was not alone. Gideon stood near the far shelves, his tall frame partially obscured by shadow, a book already in his hand, though he had not yet opened it. He seemed to be studying her instead, with the same quiet, assessing gaze he had used the night they first met. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said, when he realized she had noticed him. "I was told the library was rarely used at this hour." "It is not disturbed often," Elinor said, closing her book slightly, though she kept a finger between the pages to mark her place. "I come here to escape the noise of wedding preparations." "A sensible strategy," Gideon said, moving closer, though he stopped a respectful distance away, near enough to converse but far enough to maintain propriety. "May I ask what you are reading?" Elinor held up the book slightly, revealing the worn cover. "Poetry, nothing of consequence." "Poetry is rarely without consequence," Gideon said. "Though I confess I have read very little of it in recent years. There was not much room for verse where I was stationed." Something in his tone, quiet and distant, made Elinor set aside her earlier reservations and ask the question that had been lingering in her mind since the night on the dark road. What was it like there, wherever you were for those 6 years? For a long moment, Gideon said nothing, and Alina wondered if she had overstepped, if she had touched upon some wound too raw to be spoken of casually in a quiet library on an ordinary afternoon. But then he moved to the window seat across from her and sat down, setting his unopened book aside. It was difficult, he said finally. Difficult in ways that are hard to explain to someone who has not experienced it. There were long stretches of tedium, followed by moments of terrible clarity, when everything else fell away and all that mattered was the next decision, the next order, the next breath. I learned very quickly that hesitation costs lives. I learned to make decisions without flinching, and I learned that once you have made such decisions, you carry them with you long after the circumstances that required them have passed. Alina listened, unable to look away from the quiet intensity in his expression, the way his usual composure seemed to slip slightly, revealing something rawer and more honest beneath it. "Is that why they call you what they call you?" she asked carefully. "Ruthless, cold, merciless." A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "I have heard those words applied to me many times. I do not entirely dispute them. War does not leave room for softness, Lady Alina, and I was very good at my duties, which required a great deal of hardness. But I have found, since returning, that the world expects me to remain exactly as it imagines me, without ever asking whether the man beneath the reputation might be different." "And is he," Alina asked softly, "different?" Gideon studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze made her pulse quicken uncomfortably. "I am beginning to wonder that myself," he said finally, "since returning to England." The silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation, charged with something neither of them dared name aloud. Alina was the first to break it, standing abruptly and gathering her book against her chest, as though it could shield her from whatever was happening between them. "I should return to my duties," she said. "My mother will be looking for me regarding the wedding arrangements." "Of course," Gideon said, rising as well, though he made no move to stop her. "Thank you for the conversation, Lady Alina. It has been some time since I spoke so plainly with anyone." That conversation, brief as it was, marked the beginning of a pattern that continued over the following weeks. Alina told herself each time that it would be the last, that she would maintain proper distance from her father's business associate, that her afternoons in the library and her occasional walks through the gardens were simply coincidental encounters rather than something she began, quietly and without admitting it to herself, to anticipate. She learned gradually that Gideon Ashcroft was nothing like the cold, merciless figure whispered about in London drawing rooms. He was quiet, yes, and guarded, but beneath that guarded exterior lay a sharp intelligence, a dry sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly during their conversations, and a loneliness so profound it sometimes caught in Alina's chest like a physical ache. He told her in fragments over several weeks about his childhood, about a father who had died when Gideon was young, leaving him to inherit a title and estate far too early, about the years of military service that had taken him away from everything familiar, about returning home to find that the England he remembered had changed in ways both subtle and profound. In turn, Alina found herself confiding things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even her closest friends. She told him about the quiet suffocation of always being told what was expected of her, about the careful, practiced version of herself she presented at every social gathering, about the strange emptiness she felt whenever she imagined her future with Edmund Caro stretching out before her, orderly and predictable and utterly without warmth. "He does not know you at all, does he?" Gideon asked one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens, maintaining the careful distance propriety demanded, though the space between them felt increasingly difficult to sustain. "He knows what he needs to know," Alina said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Our marriage was arranged for practical reasons. Love was never part of the agreement." "And do you believe that is enough?" Gideon asked, stopping beneath the shade of an old oak tree, turning to face her directly. "To live an entire life built on practicality alone, without ever knowing what it might feel like to be truly known by another person." Alina opened her mouth to answer, to give the sensible, expected response about duty and family obligation and the foolishness of romantic notions in matters of marriage. But looking into his eyes, steady and searching, she found she could not force the words out. "I do not know," she admitted instead, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to believe it was enough. I am no longer certain." Something shifted in Gideon's expression, something fierce and controlled all at once, and for one breathless moment, Alina thought he might close the distance between them entirely. Instead, he stepped back, his jaw tight, his hands clenched briefly at his sides before releasing. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I forget myself sometimes in your company. It is not my place to question your engagement or your future." "Gideon," Alina said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, the word slipping out before she could stop it. He went very still at the sound of it. "I do not mind the questions. I find I have very few people in my life who ask them honestly." They stood there for a long moment, the garden quiet around them, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass, and Alina felt, with a growing sense of dread and wonder in equal measure, that whatever was happening between them had moved far beyond the boundaries of simple friendship or business convenience. It was Edmund's arrival the following week, unannounced and clearly displeased, that shattered the fragile bubble they had constructed around their quiet afternoons together. Alina was in the garden with Gideon when Edmund found them, walking slowly along the same path where they had spoken so honestly days before, their conversation this time light and easy, nothing improper in either their words or their distance from one another. But Edmund's expression, when he rounded the corner and saw them together, was thunderous. "Alina," he said sharply, his eyes moving between her and Gideon with obvious suspicion, "I did not expect to find you occupied." "Lord Caro," Gideon said, his tone perfectly calm, betraying nothing of the tension Alina could feel radiating from him. "Lady Alina and I were discussing matters related to the shipping arrangement with her father. I find her insights on trade quite valuable." It was a smooth lie, delivered without hesitation, and Alina marveled briefly at how easily Gideon could shift from raw honesty to practiced deception when the situation demanded it. But Edmund's expression did not soften. "I was not aware my future wife had developed such expertise in maritime trade," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made Alina's stomach tighten. "Perhaps you might spare her further education on the subject and attend to your business with the Earl directly, rather than his daughter." "Edmund," Alina said, stepping forward, "there is no need for such tone. We were simply walking in the gardens." "Simply walking," Edmund repeated, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity she rarely saw from him, an intensity that felt less like concern and more like possession. "I have heard the talk among the servants, Alina. I have heard how often you and the Duke find yourselves in each other's company. I would advise you to remember your position and your obligations before such talk grows into something far more damaging." The threat, thinly veiled beneath polite words, hung in the air between them. Alina felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of shame and anger. Shame that there was perhaps some truth to what he implied. Anger that he would speak to her this way in front of another man, as though she were a possession requiring correction rather than a person capable of her own decisions. Gideon's expression, meanwhile, had gone very cold, his earlier ease replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "Lord Caro," he said, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable warning, "I would advise you to remember that you are addressing a lady, and to choose your words accordingly, regardless of the frustrations you may be experiencing." For a moment the two men stared at each other, and Alina felt certain the tension between them might finally break into something openly hostile. But Edmund, perhaps recognizing the futility of challenging a man with Gideon's reputation directly, forced a tight smile instead. "Of course," he said, "forgive my tone. I am simply eager to see my future secured, Your Grace, and I trust you understand a man's natural concern for his betrothed's reputation." "I understand it perfectly," Gideon said, though something in his tone suggested he understood far more than Edmund intended to reveal. Edmund extended his hand to Elinor, a clear signal that their walk together had concluded, and Elinor, aware of the impossibility of refusing without causing a greater scene, took his arm and allowed him to lead her back toward the house. But she could not resist glancing back once, over her shoulder, to where Gideon remained standing beneath the old oak tree, his expression unreadable once more, watching her leave with an intensity that stayed with her long after she had returned to her room. That night, unable to sleep, Elinor sat by her window for hours, staring out at the darkened gardens where she had walked with Gideon just hours before, turning over Edmund's words in her mind, turning over Gideon's, and finding with growing unease that she no longer knew which future frightened her more, the one that had already been decided for her, or the one that seemed to be forming, quietly and dangerously, whether she permitted it or not. In the days following the confrontation in the garden, Edmund began visiting Camden House with far greater frequency than he ever had before, and Elinor quickly understood that his sudden attentiveness had little to do with genuine affection and everything to do with marking his territory. He appeared at breakfast, uninvited but welcomed warmly by her father, who remained blissfully unaware of the tension simmering beneath his roof. He accompanied her on errands into the village that she had previously managed perfectly well on her own. He inserted himself into conversations between Elinor and her mother regarding wedding preparations, offering opinions on matters he had shown no interest in before, simply, it seemed, to demonstrate his authority over the proceedings. Elinor bore it with the patient resignation she had always shown toward her engagement, telling herself that this was simply what marriage would require of her, a lifetime of deferring to a man's preferences and priorities over her own. But something had shifted in her since the night on the dark road, since the quiet afternoons in the library and the honest conversations in the garden, and she found herself increasingly unable to ignore the small, cold voice in the back of her mind that whispered this was not how it was supposed to feel. The truth of Edmund's character revealed itself fully one afternoon nearly 2 weeks later, during a visit to the milliner's shop in the village, where Elinor had gone to select fabric for her wedding gown. She had chosen a particular shade of pale blue silk, one that complemented her coloring beautifully, and had been discussing the details with the shop's proprietress when Edmund arrived unannounced, having learned of her outing from a servant. "That will not do," he said without preamble, examining the fabric she had selected with obvious displeasure. "Blue is far too plain for a wedding of this significance. You will choose the ivory silk instead, the one with the embroidered detail. It photographs far better, and it will please my mother considerably." "I prefer the blue," Elinor said, keeping her voice level despite the flash of irritation that rose in her chest. "It suits me better." "This is not about what suits you, Elinor," Edmund said, his tone carrying an edge of impatience that made the shop proprietress busy herself suddenly with rearranging bolts of fabric nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the exchange. "This is about what represents our families appropriately. You will select the ivory." "Edmund," Elinor said quietly, aware of the eyes of other shoppers in the small establishment beginning to turn toward them, "this is my wedding gown. Surely I am permitted some say in its selection." "You are permitted whatever say I deem appropriate," Edmund said, and though his voice remained low, there was something in his tone, something cold and controlling, that made Elinor's stomach twist unpleasantly. "I would think, given everything my family is providing for this match, you might show a bit more gratitude and considerably less argument." The words landed like a slap, and Elinor felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of humiliation and anger. She had known, in some distant, theoretical way, that Edmund considered their marriage primarily a matter of practical benefit, but she had never before heard him state so plainly that her own preferences mattered so little to him, that even something as personal as her wedding gown was subject to his approval rather than her own choice. "I will select the ivory," she said finally, her voice tight, because arguing further in a public shop would only draw more attention and further embarrassment, and because some part of her, the part trained since childhood to avoid conflict and maintain appearances, simply did not know how to resist him directly. Edmund's expression relaxed immediately, as though the matter had never been in question at all. "Good. I am glad we understand each other." They did understand each other. Earl'S thought bitterly as she watched him turn to discuss payment arrangements with the proprietress, though not in the way he believed. She understood, with growing clarity, exactly what kind of marriage awaited her, one in which her opinions would be tolerated only so long as they aligned with his own, one in which her comfort and preferences would always come second to appearances and practical benefit. It was on the ride home, sitting silently beside Edmund in his carriage, that Earl'S first allowed herself to fully compare him to Gideon Ashcroft, and the comparison left her feeling hollow. Where Edmund demanded and dismissed, Gideon asked and listened. Where Edmund saw her as an extension of his own reputation and comfort, Gideon seemed genuinely curious about her thoughts, her opinions, the person she was beyond her role as a future wife and hostess. She tried to push the thoughts away, reminding herself firmly that such comparisons were dangerous and unproductive. Gideon Ashcroft was not her betrothed. He was a temporary guest in her father's house, a business associate whose presence would eventually conclude, leaving her to marry Edmund exactly as planned. Whatever strange connection had formed between them during their quiet conversations was, she told herself, simply a product of circumstance, nothing more than the natural result of spending time together during an unusual arrangement. But that evening, when she returned to Camden House and found Gideon in the drawing room reviewing documents with her father, and he glanced up at her entrance with an expression of immediate concern, clearly noting something troubled in her demeanor, despite her attempts to appear composed. Earl'S understood that her feelings toward him were far more complicated than mere circumstance. "Lady Earl'S," Gideon said, rising from his chair, though her father remained absorbed in the documents before him, oblivious to the exchange. "You appear tired. I trust your outing was successful." "Successful enough," Earl'S said, forcing a smile that felt brittle even to herself. "Wedding preparations are demanding, Your Grace, but I am managing well." Gideon studied her for a long moment, and Earl'S had the distinct impression that he saw straight through her carefully constructed composure to the frustration and hurt lying just beneath it. "If you should ever wish to discuss matters that trouble you," he said quietly, "I am, as always, willing to listen." The simple offer, so different from anything Edmund had ever extended to her, nearly undid the fragile control she had maintained since leaving the milliner's shop. She excused herself quickly, retreating to her room before the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes could fall in front of him. It was later that same week that Gideon witnessed for himself the true nature of Edmund's character, during a formal dinner hosted at Camden House to celebrate the progress of both the wedding preparations and the shipping arrangement between Gideon and the Earl. The evening had proceeded pleasantly enough through the first several courses, filled with polite conversation and the comfortable clinking of silverware, until Earl'S made the mistake of offering an opinion during a discussion of the wedding guest list. "Perhaps we might reconsider inviting the Whitfield family," she suggested carefully, aware that the subject had already been decided by Edmund and his mother weeks before, but hoping her gentle suggestion might be considered rather than dismissed. "I understand there was some disagreement between our families in the past, and I would hate for the day to be marred by any awkwardness." Edmund's expression darkened immediately. "The Whitfield matter has already been decided, Earl'S. I do not appreciate you raising it again at dinner in front of guests." "I only meant—" "I know precisely what you meant," Edmund interrupted, his voice sharp enough that several guests at the table fell silent, their attention drawn uncomfortably toward the exchange. "You meant to undermine a decision that has already been settled in front of company, which is precisely the kind of behavior that reflects poorly on both of us. I would ask that you refrain from further comment on matters that do not concern you." The table fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the soft clink of Earl'S fork as she set it down carefully beside her plate, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. Her father, seated at the head of the table, opened his mouth as though to intervene, but seemed uncertain how to address the situation without causing further scene, and ultimately said nothing. It was Gideon who broke the silence, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel beneath its measured tone. "I have always found," he said, addressing the table generally though his eyes remained fixed on Edmund, "that a woman's thoughtful suggestions regarding matters that will affect her own wedding day are rarely something to be dismissed so sharply. Lady Alina's concern for a smooth and harmonious celebration seems, to my mind, entirely reasonable." Edmund's jaw tightened visibly. "With respect, Your Grace, this is a private family matter, and I would ask that you allow me to manage my own affairs without interference." "Of course," Gideon said, his tone remaining perfectly pleasant despite the obvious tension beneath the exchange. "Though I would note that a man's treatment of his betrothed, particularly in company, tends to reveal a great deal about his character to those observing. I offer the observation only in the spirit of friendly counsel." The warning, delivered with such calm precision, hung over the table like a blade, and Alina watched Edmund's face shift through several expressions: anger, humiliation, and finally a forced, brittle smile as he attempted to salvage the moment. "Naturally, Your Grace. I appreciate your concern for my future wife's happiness." The conversation moved awkwardly onward to other matters, but Alina barely heard any of it, her attention consumed by the memory of Gideon's quiet intervention, the way he had defended her without hesitation, without seeming to weigh the political cost of publicly challenging a man of Edmund's standing. No one in the entire course of her engagement had ever spoken up for her so directly, so unapologetically. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the house had settled into quiet, Alina found herself once again in the garden, unable to sleep, unable to stop replaying the dinner in her mind. She was not entirely surprised when she heard footsteps approaching along the gravel path and turned to find Gideon walking toward her, his expression troubled in a way she had not seen from him before. "I apologize if my comments this evening caused you further difficulty," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I know it is not my place to interfere in matters between you and your betrothed." "You need not apologize," Alina said softly. "No one has ever spoken to him that way on my behalf. I confess I did not know how badly I needed someone to." Gideon's expression softened, though something dark and troubled remained in his eyes. "Alina," he said, using her given name for only the second time since they had met, "I must ask you something, and I hope you will forgive the directness of the question. Does he often speak to you that way? Does he often dismiss you so completely?" Alina hesitated, torn between loyalty to the arrangement her family had built and the growing, undeniable truth of her situation. "It has become more common," she admitted finally, the words heavy with a shame she had not realized she carried. "I had told myself it was simply his nature, that once we were married, matters would settle, that this was merely the stress of wedding preparations affecting his temper." "And do you still believe that?" Gideon asked quietly. Alina looked up at him, at the steady, searching intensity in his eyes, and felt the careful walls she had built around her own doubts begin to crack. "I do not know what I believe anymore," she whispered. "I only know that this arrangement cannot be broken without disgracing my family, without destroying everything my father has worked to build through this match. I am bound to it, Gideon, whatever doubts I may carry." "Bound by duty," Gideon said, "but not, I think, by desire." The words hung between them in the cool night air, and Alina found she had no answer to offer, because he had spoken a truth she had not yet allowed herself to fully acknowledge, not even in the privacy of her own thoughts. "I cannot break this engagement," she said finally, though her voice trembled slightly. "Whatever I feel, whatever doubts I carry, I have a duty to my family. Please, Gideon, do not ask me to choose between that duty and something else, something I am not even certain I understand myself." Gideon studied her for a long moment, and Alina watched him wrestle visibly with some internal decision, his jaw tight, his hands clenched briefly at his sides before he finally stepped back, putting proper distance between them once more. "I would never ask you to choose against your duty, Alina," he said quietly. "But I would ask you to consider, carefully and honestly, whether the duty you are so determined to fulfill is truly worth the cost it demands of you. He left her standing alone in the garden then, the cool night air settling around her like a blanket, and Alina remained there for a long time afterward, staring up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. Wrestling with a question she was no longer certain she had the strength or the courage to answer honestly. The storm arrived without warning, the way storms so often do in the countryside, building from a gray, uncertain sky into something fierce and unrelenting within the space of a single afternoon. Alina had accompanied her father and Gideon on a visit to inspect a piece of coastal property under consideration for the shipping venture, a trip that was meant to last only a few hours before returning to Camden House well before evening. Instead, they found themselves caught nearly 2 hours from home when the rain began, sudden and violent, turning the country roads to thick, impassable mud within minutes. "We cannot continue in this," Gideon said, raising his voice above the pounding rain and the frightened whinnying of the horses as their carriage lurched dangerously on the slick road. "There is a hunting lodge belonging to my estate not far from here. We should seek shelter there until the storm passes." Charles Winters, seated across from his daughter with an expression of considerable alarm as the carriage swayed and shuddered around them, nodded quickly in agreement. "Whatever you think best, Your Grace. I have no desire to test our luck further on these roads." The lodge, when they finally reached it after a harrowing quarter-hour navigating flooding paths and near blinding rain, proved to be a modest but sturdy structure, clearly maintained for occasional use rather than regular habitation, but warm and dry once they managed to get a fire going in the main hearth. Gideon's driver saw to the horses and carriage as best he could, while the small staff who maintained the lodge, alerted by the sudden arrival, hurried to prepare what comfort they could offer on short notice. It was perhaps an hour into their unexpected stay, as the storm continued to rage outside with no sign of relenting, that Charles Winters, exhausted from the ordeal of the journey and warmed considerably by the brandy offered by the lodge's small staff, retired to one of the modest bedrooms to rest, leaving Alina and Gideon alone before the fire in the main hall. Alina sat wrapped in a blanket someone had provided, watching the flames dance and crackle, acutely aware of Gideon seated in the chair across from her, the firelight casting deep shadows across the sharp planes of his face. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the hills, but inside the small lodge, everything felt strangely quiet, suspended in a bubble of unexpected intimacy neither of them had anticipated. "Your father seems entirely unbothered by our misadventure," Gideon observed, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I confess I expected more concern about propriety, given the circumstances." "My father trusts you a great deal," Alina said. "Perhaps too much, given how little he actually knows about your true intentions in staying so close to our family." The words slipped out before she could stop them, sharper and more revealing than she had intended, and she watched Gideon's expression shift, a flicker of something unguarded crossing his features before his usual composure returned. "And what do you believe my true intentions to be, Lady Alina?" he asked quietly. Alina hesitated, the fire crackling between them, the storm outside providing a strange kind of cover for the honesty she felt building in her chest. Honesty she had suppressed for weeks beneath careful politeness and dutiful restraint. "I believe," she said slowly, "that your interest in shipping and trade, while genuine enough, is not the true reason you have remained so close to my family these past weeks." Gideon was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire, and Alina wondered if she had finally pushed too far, if she had shattered whatever careful balance they had maintained between honest friendship and something neither of them had dared to name. But when he finally spoke, his voice was low and unguarded in a way she had never heard from him before. "You are correct," he said simply. "The shipping venture is genuine, but it was never the reason I sought your father's acquaintance so persistently. I sought it because it gave me a reason to remain near you, Alina, when every rule of propriety and every ounce of good sense told me I had no right to do so." Alina's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it over the storm outside. "Gideon, let me finish," he said, rising from his chair and crossing to the window, staring out into the darkness and the rain as though gathering the courage to continue. "I have spent 6 years in circumstances that stripped away every comfortable illusion I once held about the world, about people, about myself. I learned to expect very little from life beyond duty and survival. I did not expect, upon returning to England, to find myself utterly unable to stop thinking about a woman I encountered by pure chance on a dark and muddy road." He turned to face her then, and the raw honesty in his expression stole whatever composed response Elinor might have offered. "I am not a man given to romantic declarations, Elinor. I have spent too many years learning to guard my heart carefully, to trust almost nothing beyond what I could verify with my own eyes and hands. But I find, in your company, that every careful guard I built over those 6 years has proven remarkably useless. I think of you constantly. I arrange my days around the possibility of encountering you. I have made myself a fixture in your father's household purely for the chance to remain near you, and I no longer have the strength, or perhaps the desire, to pretend otherwise." Elinor rose slowly from her chair, the blanket slipping from her shoulders forgotten as she crossed the small distance between them. "Gideon, I am promised to another man. Whatever you feel, whatever I might feel in return, changes nothing about the reality of my circumstances." "Does it not?" Gideon asked, his voice quiet but intense, his eyes searching hers with an urgency that made her pulse race. "Tell me honestly, Elinor, looking at me now, that you feel nothing beyond simple friendship. Tell me that the thought of marrying Edmund Carow does not fill you with the same quiet dread I see in your eyes every time his name is mentioned. Tell me that, and I will never speak of this again. I will withdraw from your family's affairs entirely, and you will never be troubled by my presence again." Elinor opened her mouth to say the words, to offer the sensible denial that duty and propriety demanded of her. But standing so close to him, feeling the warmth radiating from him despite the cold storm outside, seeing the raw vulnerability in eyes that the entire world believed incapable of such feeling, she found she could not force the lie past her lips. "I cannot tell you that," she whispered instead, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "Because it would not be true. I have thought of nothing but you since that night on the road, Gideon. I have counted the hours until our conversations in the library, treasured every moment in the garden far more than I should. I have compared Edmund to you 100 times, and each time, the comparison has left me more certain than ever that whatever I am meant to feel toward the man I am promised to marry, I do not feel it. I feel it instead toward you, and I do not know what to do with that knowledge, because it changes nothing about my circumstances. It only makes them infinitely more painful." The words, once released, seemed to break something open between them, and before Elinor fully understood what was happening, Gideon had closed the remaining distance, his hand rising to gently cup her face, his thumb tracing softly along her cheekbone with a tenderness that seemed entirely at odds with everything London society believed about the man they called Ruthless. "Elinor," he said, her name a low, reverent sound on his lips, "I know I have no right to ask this of you. I know your engagement is a matter of family honor and obligation that extends far beyond your own wishes, but I cannot continue pretending that my feelings for you are anything less than what they are. I care for you more deeply than I have cared for anything in the 6 years I spent believing myself incapable of such feeling entirely." Elinor closed her eyes briefly, leaning almost imperceptibly into his touch before catching herself and stepping back, putting careful distance between them once more, though every part of her rebelled against the movement. "We cannot do this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My father has already accepted the arrangement with Edmund. Breaking the engagement now would bring scandal upon our family, would damage relationships my father has spent years cultivating, would likely ruin any chance of a respectable future for me at all. I cannot simply follow my heart, Gideon, however much I might wish to." "I understand the risks," Gideon said, though frustration was evident in the tightness of his jaw. I'm not asking you to abandon your family or your future recklessly. I'm only asking you to acknowledge what exists between us, so that we are not both suffering in silence, pretending feelings that have clearly become impossible to ignore." "Acknowledging it changes nothing," Elinor said, though her voice broke slightly on the words. "It only makes the eventual parting more painful when I am finally married to Edmund and you have returned to your own life, your own estate, your own future." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an intensity that made her chest ache. "Perhaps," he said finally, "there is another possibility neither of us has yet considered." "What possibility?" Elinor asked, though something in his tone made her wary of the answer. "I do not yet know," Gideon admitted. "But I refuse to accept that the only two outcomes available to us are your unhappy marriage to a man who dismisses and controls you, or a lifetime of quiet longing between us that neither of us chooses to act upon. I have spent 6 years believing there was no version of my future that included happiness of this kind. I am not prepared to abandon the possibility now that I have finally found it, simply because the path forward is difficult." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small lodge, something had shifted permanently between them, an honesty that could not be easily taken back or forgotten, however impossible their circumstances remained. Elinor did not know, standing there in the firelight with Gideon's confession still hanging in the air between them, how any of this could possibly resolve itself without significant pain to someone, whether herself, her family, or the man to whom she remained bound by promise and duty. But she knew, with absolute and terrifying certainty, that whatever happened next, she could no longer pretend that her feelings for Gideon Ashcroft were anything less than what they truly were. They remained by the fire long into the night, speaking quietly of matters both trivial and profound, of childhood memories and future hopes neither had dared voice aloud before, until exhaustion finally overtook them both, and Elinor retired to the small bedroom prepared for her, leaving Gideon alone before the dying fire, his expression unreadable once more, though something in his posture suggested a man who had finally allowed himself to hope for something he had long believed impossible. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving the countryside washed clean and gleaming under pale morning sunlight, and the small party made their way back toward Camden House in far more ordinary circumstances than the previous evening had offered. But as their carriage rolled along the now passable roads, Elinor caught Gideon's eye across the small space, and the quiet understanding that passed between them carried the weight of everything left unspoken, everything acknowledged the night before, everything that now hung suspended between duty and desire, waiting for some resolution neither of them could yet see clearly. Charles Winters, still unaware of the profound shift that had occurred within his own household, spoke cheerfully of the successful business discussions that had prompted their journey, entirely oblivious to the far more significant conversation that had taken place while he slept soundly through the storm. Elinor, watching the countryside pass by outside the carriage window, felt the full weight of her impossible situation settle over her like a physical burden. She was promised to one man and had confessed her heart to another, and somewhere in the weeks ahead, that impossible tension would have to break, one way or another, regardless of how carefully she tried to avoid the reckoning. She did not yet know how right she was, or how quickly that reckoning would arrive. It was Margaret, Elinor's longtime maid and the closest thing she had to a true confidant within the household staff, who first warned her that whispers had begun circulating below stairs regarding her relationship with the Duke of Ravenswood. Margaret delivered the warning quietly one morning while helping Elinor dress, her expression carefully neutral, though the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. "The other servants have noticed, my lady," Margaret said, fastening the buttons along Elinor's back with practiced fingers. "The time you spend with His Grace, the way you look at each other when you believe no one is watching. I do not say this to cause you distress, but I would be a poor friend if I did not warn you that such talk, once it begins among the staff, rarely remains contained for long." Elinor's stomach tightened with dread. Has anyone spoken of it beyond the household? "Not yet to my knowledge," Margaret said. But servants talk to other servants, my lady, at markets and in taverns, and such stories have a way of traveling far faster than anyone intends. I would counsel caution, particularly given how close your wedding date has become." Elinor thanked Margaret for the warning, but the words settled uneasily in her chest throughout the remainder of the day, a constant, nagging reminder of exactly how precarious her situation had become. She resolved, with considerable difficulty, to maintain greater distance from Gideon in the days that followed, to limit their conversations to matters of strict propriety, to avoid the quiet afternoons in the library and the private walks through the garden that had become such treasured, dangerous parts of her routine. Her resolve lasted less than a week. It was not any deliberate choice on either of their parts that finally exposed the situation, but rather a moment of simple, unguarded honesty that happened to be witnessed by the wrong person at precisely the wrong time. Elinor had been walking alone through the gardens one afternoon, lost in troubled thought, when she encountered Gideon returning from a ride, his horse lathered from exertion, his expression brightening immediately upon seeing her despite the careful distance they had both been attempting to maintain. "Elinor," he said, dismounting and approaching her with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the preceding weeks, entirely forgetting, in the pleasure of the unexpected encounter, the caution they had both promised themselves. "I did not expect to find you out here today." "I needed air," Elinor admitted, and despite her earlier resolve, she found herself smiling at him in a way that spoke far more plainly than any words could have of the feelings she had been trying so desperately to conceal. They spoke for only a few minutes, nothing improper in either their words or their conduct, but the warmth between them, the easy familiarity, the way Gideon's hand briefly touched her arm as he described some minor mishap during his ride, was more than enough to confirm every suspicion that had been whispered among the household staff. What neither of them realized was that Charles Winters, returning early from a meeting in the village, had witnessed the entire exchange from an upstairs window, his expression darkening with each passing moment. That evening, Elinor was summoned to her father's study, a location she rarely visited except for the most serious of family discussions, and the moment she entered and saw her father's grim expression, she understood immediately that Margaret's warning had proven tragically accurate. "Sit down, Elinor," Charles said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "We have a matter of considerable importance to discuss." Elinor sat, her heart pounding, though she tried to maintain a composed expression despite the dread building steadily within her chest. "I witnessed you this afternoon in the garden with the Duke of Ravenswood," her father continued, his fingers drumming impatiently against the surface of his desk. "I have also received word, through channels I would rather not have needed, that talk has begun among our household staff regarding an inappropriate closeness between you and His Grace. Tell me plainly, Elinor, and I expect the complete truth. Is there any substance to these rumors?" Elinor's mind raced, searching desperately for some response that might protect both herself and Gideon without requiring an outright lie to her father's face. But the weeks of honesty she had shared with Gideon, the confession by the fireside during the storm, had left her unable to summon the practiced deceptions that might once have come more easily. "Father," she said carefully, "His Grace and I have developed a friendship during his time in our household. I will not pretend otherwise, but nothing improper has occurred between us." Charles's expression grew even darker. "A friendship," he repeated, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Elinor, you are engaged to be married in a matter of weeks. Whatever friendship you believe you have developed with the Duke of Ravenswood must end immediately. Do you understand me? This family's reputation, everything I have worked to build through your match with Lord Carow, cannot survive the scandal of talk regarding my daughter's inappropriate attachment to another man while promised to marry someone else." "Father, please," Elinor said, her composure finally cracking. "You do not understand the situation fully. Edmund does not treat me with kindness or respect. He controls every aspect of our wedding preparations, dismisses my opinions entirely, speaks to me with contempt whenever I dare voice a thought that differs from his own. I have tried to accept this as simply the nature of our arrangement, but I cannot pretend any longer that I look forward to a lifetime bound to a man who values my compliance far more than my happiness." Charles's expression shifted slightly at this, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his features, but it was quickly overtaken by the practical, calculating expression Alina had come to recognize whenever matters of family reputation and financial arrangement were at stake. "Marriage is rarely a matter of personal happiness, Alina," he said, his tone somewhat gentler now, though no less firm. "It is a matter of duty, of securing the family's future, of maintaining the connections and reputation that allow us to continue moving in the circles we occupy. Lord Caro's family fortune and standing will benefit not only you, but your mother, your future children, and the Camden name for generations to come. I understand that his manner may sometimes be difficult, but such difficulties are common in marriages built for practical benefit rather than romantic sentiment, and most women learn to navigate them successfully." "And if I cannot?" Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I cannot bear a lifetime of being dismissed and controlled by a man who sees me as nothing more than an extension of his own status." "Then you will learn to bear it," Charles said, his voice hardening once more. "Because the alternative, breaking this engagement now, after everything has been arranged and announced, would bring ruin upon this family that no amount of personal happiness could ever justify. I will not allow whatever romantic notions you have developed regarding the Duke of Ravenswood to destroy everything I have built for this family's future." The threat, delivered so plainly, left Alina reeling, and she understood with growing horror that her father intended to address the situation directly, regardless of the consequences to her own heart. "I intend to speak with His Grace directly," Charles continued, confirming her worst fears. "I will make clear that his continued closeness with you cannot be tolerated, and that his presence in this household must conclude far sooner than originally planned, before further talk can damage this family's reputation beyond repair." "Father, please do not." "This matter is settled, Alina," Charles interrupted, his tone leaving no room for further argument. "I would also advise you that I intend to speak with Lord Caro regarding moving your wedding date forward, given the current circumstances. A shorter engagement will limit the opportunity for further scandal, and will ensure this matter is resolved before it can grow into something truly damaging." Alina left her father's study in a state of numb shock, the weight of his words settling over her like a physical burden she could barely carry. Her wedding, already looming closer than she wished, was about to be moved forward even further, and Gideon, the one person who had shown her genuine care and understanding, would soon be forced from their household entirely, his presence deemed too dangerous to their family's carefully constructed reputation. She found him that evening in the study he had been using for his business correspondence, his expression grave, and she understood immediately that her father had already spoken with him. "He has asked me to conclude our business arrangement and depart Camden House within the week," Gideon said without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. He was not unkind about it, but he was entirely clear regarding his reasons, and I cannot fault his logic, however much it pains me to accept it. Alina felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she fought fiercely to hold them back. "He also intends to move the wedding date forward," she said, "to ensure the matter is resolved before further talk can spread." Gideon's jaw tightened visibly at this news, and for a long moment he said nothing, staring at the documents scattered across the desk before him without truly seeing them. "Alina," he said finally, "I cannot simply walk away and allow you to be forced into a marriage that will bring you nothing but unhappiness, particularly not now, when I know without any doubt how you truly feel." "What choice do either of us have?" Alina asked, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain composed. "My father has made his position entirely clear. Any further resistance on my part risks not only my own reputation, but the financial security of my entire family. I cannot ask you to interfere further, Gideon. I cannot ask you to risk everything for a situation that may prove impossible to resolve regardless of what either of us wishes. You are not asking me, Gideon said, rising from his chair and crossing to where she stood, taking her hands gently in his own despite the risk of discovery. I am choosing this, Earl'S, because I refuse to accept that the only path forward is your unhappiness. I need time, a few days at most, to consider matters more carefully before I depart. Will you trust me even now, even with everything working against us? Earl'S looked into his eyes, searching for some certainty she desperately needed but could not quite locate amid the chaos of her circumstances. I do not know what choice you believe you have, she said softly, but I trust you, Gideon. Whatever happens next, I trust you completely. He pressed a gentle kiss to the back of her hand, a gesture so simple yet so charged with meaning that Earl'S felt it resonate through her entire body. Then give me these few days, he said. I promise you, Earl'S, I will not allow you to be sacrificed to a marriage that will only bring you misery, not while there remains any possibility of another path forward. She left him that evening with cautious hope kindling weakly in her chest, though the practical reality of her situation remained as dire as ever. Her wedding date would soon be moved forward. Gideon would soon be forced from her household. And somewhere in the narrow window of days remaining before these changes took full effect, some resolution would have to be found, though Earl'S could not yet imagine what form that resolution might take. 2 days later, Edmund arrived at Camden House with an expression of triumphant satisfaction that immediately set Earl'S nerves on edge. He requested a private audience with her in the drawing room, and once the door had closed behind them, ensuring their privacy, his expression shifted from satisfaction to something colder and more calculating. I understand there has been some difficulty regarding your closeness with the Duke of Ravenswood, he said without preamble, his tone carrying an edge of barely restrained anger despite his outward composure. Your father has assured me the matter has been addressed appropriately, and that his presence in your household will soon conclude entirely. Edmund, I assure you, nothing improper has occurred, Earl'S began, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, knowing full well how deeply her feelings for Gideon had developed regardless of what actions had or had not taken place between them. I do not particularly care what has or has not occurred, Edmund interrupted, his voice sharp. What I care about, Earl'S, is that talk of your inappropriate friendship with the Duke has already reached certain circles in London, circles that matter considerably to my family's reputation and my own political ambitions. I have therefore decided, in consultation with your father, that our wedding will take place in 3 weeks' time, rather than the 2 months originally planned. This will put an end to the talk swirling around your name, and will ensure this matter is resolved before it can cause any further damage. The announcement hit Earl'S like a physical blow, 3 weeks feeling impossibly, terrifyingly close, leaving barely any time to imagine any alternative path forward before she would be irrevocably bound to a man she had come to understand, with growing certainty, she could never truly love. 3 weeks, she repeated numbly, is very little time to prepare properly for a wedding of this significance. The preparations will be managed, Edmund said dismissively. What matters is that this matter is resolved quickly and quietly, before any lasting damage occurs to either of our families' reputations. I trust you understand the necessity of this arrangement, Earl'S, and that you will conduct yourself appropriately in the weeks remaining before our marriage, without further complications regarding the Duke of Ravenswood or anyone else. The thinly veiled warning in his final words left no room for misunderstanding, and Earl'S felt the walls of her carefully arranged future closing in around her with terrifying speed. 3 weeks remained before she would become Edmund Caro's wife, bound permanently to a man who saw her primarily as a means of protecting his reputation and securing his political ambitions, while the one man who had shown her genuine understanding and care would soon be forced entirely from her life. She left the drawing room that evening in a state of quiet desperation, uncertain whether Gideon's promise of finding another path forward could possibly be fulfilled within such a narrow window of time, uncertain whether any resolution existed that could save her from the fate now rapidly closing in around her, regardless of how fiercely her heart rebelled against it. Somewhere in the days that followed, she would learn the truth, that Gideon Ashcroft, despite his fearsome reputation and carefully guarded heart, was not a man who accepted defeat easily, and that the plan already forming in his mind would soon change everything, for better or for worse, before her wedding day could ever arrive. Gideon Ashcroft had not spent 6 years leading soldiers through difficult and dangerous circumstances without learning a crucial lesson, that the most effective way to defeat an opponent was rarely through direct confrontation, but through patient, careful investigation that revealed weaknesses invisible to those who relied solely on force or bluster. And so, in the days following Edmund's announcement regarding the accelerated wedding date, Gideon turned his considerable intelligence and resources toward a single purpose: uncovering whatever truth might exist beneath Edmund Carrow's carefully cultivated public reputation. He began with his own network of contacts, men he had served alongside, and others he had encountered through years of business dealings across London and beyond, discreetly inquiring into Edmund's affairs, his finances, his conduct in circumstances beyond the watchful eyes of polite society. What he uncovered, over the course of several days of careful investigation, painted a picture considerably darker than the respectable image Edmund presented to the Winters family and the wider world. The first thread came from a solicitor Gideon had known for years, a man who handled matters of debt and financial arrangement for several prominent London families. Under careful questioning, and with the promise of discretion regarding the source of the inquiry, the solicitor revealed that Edmund Carrow's family finances, long believed secure and prosperous, had in fact suffered considerable losses over the preceding 2 years, due largely to a series of poor investments Edmund himself had made without his father's full knowledge or approval. The Carrow family estate is considerably more encumbered than public knowledge would suggest, the solicitor explained, speaking quietly in the privacy of his office. Lord Carrow's father remains unaware of the full extent of the losses, as young Lord Edmund has taken considerable pains to conceal the matter, borrowing against future income and family assets to cover the gaps, hoping, I would imagine, that a favorable marriage might resolve the difficulty before it becomes impossible to hide any longer. Gideon absorbed this information with careful interest, understanding immediately the significance of what he had learned. Edmund's eagerness for the marriage to Earl'S, his insistence on accelerating the wedding date, suddenly made a great deal more sense when viewed through the lens of financial desperation rather than romantic urgency. The Camden family's respectable fortune, while not extraordinary by the standards of the highest London society, would nonetheless provide Edmund with exactly the kind of stability his own family's finances desperately required. The second thread, more troubling still, came from conversations Gideon initiated with several former acquaintances of Edmund's, men who had known him during his years at university and in the years immediately following. What emerged from these careful conversations was a pattern of behavior that painted Edmund's treatment of Earl'S not as an unfortunate but isolated instance of temper, but as a consistent and deeply ingrained characteristic of his personality. Carrow has always been this way, one former classmate confided, after Gideon had spent considerable effort establishing enough trust to draw out honest testimony. Controlling, dismissive of anyone he considers beneath him, which includes most women in his experience. There were incidents at university, disputes with servants and tradesmen that grew considerably heated, a general pattern of expecting complete deference from anyone he considers subordinate to his own position. I would not be surprised if his future wife finds herself subjected to considerable unhappiness once the wedding celebrations conclude and the reality of daily married life sets in. The final piece of information, and perhaps the most damning, came from an unexpected source. A young woman named Beatrice Hollington, a distant cousin of Edmund's who had once been considered a potential match for him, before circumstances had led her family to withdraw from any such arrangement. Gideon arranged a discreet meeting with her through a mutual acquaintance, and what she revealed confirmed his worst suspicions regarding the man Earl'S was set to marry. My family withdrew from any consideration of marriage between myself and Edmund after witnessing his conduct during our brief courtship, Beatrice explained, her expression carefully composed despite the evident discomfort of discussing such personal matters with a relative stranger. He was charming enough in public settings, but in private, his temper proved considerably more concerning. My father witnessed an incident during a private conversation that convinced him such a match would bring our family nothing but future misery. I have heard, through family connections, that Edmund's temperament has not improved in the years since, and I confess I have felt considerable concern upon learning of his engagement to Lady Earl'S Winters. Armed with this collection of evidence, Gideon understood he possessed exactly what he needed to challenge the marriage directly. But he also understood, with the same careful strategic thinking that had served him throughout his years of military service, that a direct confrontation with Edmund himself would accomplish little beyond further scandal and potential danger to Earl'S reputation. The more effective path, he decided, lay in approaching Charles Winters directly, presenting the evidence not as an accusation born of jealousy or personal interest, but as a genuine concern for his business partner's daughter and family reputation. He requested a private meeting with Charles the following morning, and though the Earl's expression remained guarded and somewhat suspicious given the tensions of recent days, he agreed to hear what Gideon had to say. "Lord Camden," Gideon began, once they were settled in the privacy of the study, the door closed firmly against any possibility of interruption. "I understand you have significant reservations regarding my continued closeness with your daughter, and I do not intend to dispute the legitimacy of those concerns given the circumstances. However, I have uncovered information regarding Lord Carroll that I believe you deserve to know before your daughter's wedding proceeds any further. Information that concerns not merely my own feelings toward Earl'S, but the genuine welfare and future security of your entire family." Charles's expression shifted from guarded suspicion to cautious attention. "What information?" Gideon laid out what he had discovered methodically, presenting the financial difficulties plaguing the Carroll estate first, providing the name of the solicitor who could confirm the details if Charles wished to verify the claims independently. He watched the Earl's expression grow increasingly troubled as the full picture emerged, the realization dawning that the match he had believed would secure his family's future was, in fact, built upon a foundation considerably less stable than he had been led to believe. "You are certain of this information?" Charles asked, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "I would not bring it to you otherwise," Gideon said. "I understand the implications of what I am telling you, Lord Camden, and I understand that you may question my motives given my own feelings toward your daughter. But I would ask you to verify the information independently before dismissing it, and to consider carefully what it means for Earl'S future security should this marriage proceed regardless." Charles sat in troubled silence for several long moments, absorbing the weight of what he had learned. "And the matter of his temperament," he asked finally. "You mentioned other concerns as well." Gideon proceeded to describe, with careful precision, the accounts he had gathered from Edmund's former classmates and from Beatrice Hollington, watching Charles's expression grow increasingly grim with each detail. When he finished, the Earl remained silent for a long moment, staring at his own hands folded on the desk before him. "I have witnessed some of this myself," Charles admitted finally, his voice heavy with reluctant acknowledgement. "His treatment of Earl'S during our recent dinner, his manner during their disagreement at the milliner's shop, which reached my ears through servants' gossip despite my daughter's efforts to minimize the matter. I confess I chose to overlook these signs, believing them simply the ordinary friction of an engagement under stress, rather than a genuine indication of his character." "I understand the difficulty of this realization," Gideon said, his tone gentler now, recognizing the genuine distress evident in the older man's expression. "You built this arrangement in good faith, believing it would secure your daughter's future and your family's prosperity. But I would ask you to consider, now that you possess this fuller picture, whether proceeding with this marriage truly serves those goals, or whether it risks binding Alina to a lifetime of unhappiness with a man whose financial instability and difficult temperament could ultimately damage this family's reputation and security far more severely than any scandal regarding a broken engagement might cause. Charles was quiet for a long time, and Gideon waited patiently, understanding that a man's entire understanding of his family's future could not be dismantled and rebuilt in a single conversation, however compelling the evidence presented. "What would you propose instead?" Charles asked finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine uncertainty Gideon had never heard from him before. This was the moment Gideon had been preparing for, and he chose his words with the same careful precision he had employed throughout the entire investigation. "I would propose an alliance between our families built upon more solid foundations," he said. "I have already established a genuine and profitable business partnership with you, Lord Camden, one that requires no dependence upon a marriage arrangement to secure its benefits. Beyond that partnership, I would ask for the opportunity to court your daughter properly, with your blessing rather than your suspicion, allowing her the chance to choose her own future rather than having it decided for her based on financial desperation and calculated ambition on Lord Caro's part." Charles studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You are asking me to break an engagement that has already been publicly announced, to risk considerable scandal and damage to this family's reputation, based upon your word and the testimony of a handful of witnesses you have gathered." "I am asking you to protect your daughter's future," Gideon said firmly, "rather than sacrifice it to a man whose own finances are unstable and whose temperament, by multiple independent accounts, promises her nothing but continued unhappiness. I understand the risk involved in breaking the engagement now, but I would ask you to weigh that risk against the far greater risk of binding Alina permanently to a marriage that serves neither her happiness nor, ultimately, this family's long-term interests." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy with the weight of a decision that would reshape not only Alina's future, but the entire trajectory of the Camden family standing within London society. Charles rose from his desk finally and moved to the window, staring out over the gardens where his daughter had walked so many times in recent weeks, first with Edmund Caro, and increasingly, with the man now standing before him offering an entirely different vision of her future. "I will need to verify what you have told me," Charles said finally, turning back to face Gideon. "I will not break my daughter's engagement based solely upon your word, however compelling your evidence appears. But I will investigate the matter personally, and if what you have told me proves accurate, I will reconsider the arrangement, for Alina's sake as much as for the sake of this family's future." It was not the immediate resolution Gideon had hoped for, but it was, he understood, considerably more than he might have expected given the circumstances only a week before. "That is all I ask," he said. "Thank you, Lord Camden, for hearing me out, and for considering Alina's genuine welfare above the convenient assumptions that brought this arrangement into being." As Gideon left the study that afternoon, he felt, for the first time in many years, something dangerously close to hope, though he understood full well that considerable obstacles remained before any resolution could be reached. Charles Winters would need days, perhaps longer, to verify the evidence and reach his own conclusions, time that Edmund Caro would surely use to his own advantage should he sense his carefully constructed arrangement beginning to crumble. And Alina, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place, remained bound by her wedding date, now barely 3 weeks away, with no guarantee that Gideon's careful investigation and strategic appeal to her father would prove sufficient to change the course already set in motion. The wolf had made his move, but the battle, Gideon understood clearly, was far from won. Charles Winters spent the following 4 days in quiet, methodical investigation, verifying every detail Gideon had presented to him through channels entirely separate from the Duke's own network. determined to reach his conclusions independently rather than relying solely upon information that might, however unlikely, have been colored by Gideon's own feelings toward Earl'S. He visited the solicitor Gideon had named, confirming the troubling state of the Caro family finances through documents the solicitor reluctantly agreed to share given the seriousness of the matter. He made discreet inquiries of his own among acquaintances who had known Edmund over the years, hearing echoes of the same troubling pattern of behavior Gideon had described. By the fourth evening, Charles understood, with the same reluctant clarity that had settled over him during his conversation with Gideon, that the marriage he had arranged for his daughter's future security was, in fact, built upon a foundation considerably more precarious than he had ever imagined, and that the man he had chosen to entrust with Earl'S happiness possessed a character far more troubling than the polished, respectable image Edmund had always presented to their family. He summoned Earl'S to his study that evening, and Earl'S, sensing immediately from her father's grave expression that something significant had occurred, entered with considerable trepidation, uncertain what news awaited her. "Sit down, Earl'S," Charles said, his voice carrying none of the anger that had characterized their previous conversation on this subject. Instead, there was something closer to regret in his tone, and perhaps, she thought as she studied his weary expression, something closer to shame as well. "Father, what has happened?" "I have spent the past several days investigating certain concerns raised regarding Lord Caro," Charles began, choosing his words carefully. "I owe you an apology, Earl'S, for not taking your earlier reservations regarding his character more seriously. What I have discovered has convinced me that this marriage, as arranged, would bring you nothing but considerable unhappiness, and would ultimately serve neither your interests nor, I now understand, this family's genuine long-term security." Earl'S listened, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing, as her father laid out the full extent of what his investigation had revealed. The troubling state of the Caro family finances, carefully concealed from public knowledge, but confirmed through documents impossible to dispute. The pattern of controlling and dismissive behavior that multiple independent sources had confirmed characterized Edmund's conduct toward those he considered beneath him. The growing certainty that Edmund's eagerness for their marriage stemmed considerably more from financial desperation than any genuine affection or respect for Earl'S herself. "I intend to break the engagement," Charles said finally, watching his daughter's face carefully for her reaction. "I understand this decision will bring considerable scandal upon our family in the short term, but I believe, having now seen the full picture clearly, that it represents the only responsible course of action available to us." Tears gathered in Earl'S eyes, tears of relief and gratitude so profound she could barely find words to express them. "Father, thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I know how difficult this decision must be for you, given everything you had hoped this marriage would secure for our family." "It was Gideon who brought this information to my attention," Charles said, a note of grudging respect entering his voice. "I confess I initially suspected his motives, believing his concerns regarding Edmund's character might be colored by his own feelings toward you. But the evidence he provided proved impossible to dispute, and I have come to understand, over these past days of investigation, that his concern for your welfare extends far beyond simple romantic interest. He has demonstrated, throughout this entire situation, a character considerably more honorable and considerate than the reputation that preceded him ever suggested." Earl'S felt her heart swell with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something else, something warmer and more powerful that she no longer felt any need to suppress or deny. "Father," she said carefully, "may I ask what this means for my future now? If the engagement to Edmund is broken, what becomes of my prospects, given the scandal such a decision will surely bring?" Charles studied her for a long moment, and something almost like a smile touched the corners of his weary expression. "The Duke of Ravenswood has expressed considerable interest in courting you properly. Earl'S, with my full blessing rather than my suspicion, should you wish to pursue such an arrangement. I confess I have come to believe, watching the two of you over these past weeks, that whatever exists between you represents something considerably more genuine and lasting than the practical arrangement I had constructed with Lord Caro. The following morning brought the confrontation that Earl'S had dreaded, but understood to be unavoidable. Edmund arrived at Camden House at her father's summons, his expression confident and entirely unsuspecting of the reversal awaiting him, and Earl'S watched from the drawing-room window as he strode up the front steps with his usual air of easy entitlement, utterly unaware that his carefully constructed future was about to collapse entirely. Charles received him in the study, with Gideon present as well, a decision that surprised Earl'S when she learned of it later, though she understood her father's reasoning. Having brought the initial concerns to light, Gideon deserved to witness the resolution of the matter directly, and his presence would leave Edmund no room to dispute the evidence or attempt to intimidate Charles into reconsidering. Edmund's confident expression shifted rapidly to alarm, and then to barely controlled fury as Charles laid out, point by point, the evidence that had come to light regarding his family's financial difficulties and his own troubling pattern of behavior toward those he considered beneath his station. He attempted, initially, to dismiss the claims entirely, insisting the financial concerns were minor and easily resolved, that any accounts of his temperament had been exaggerated or misrepresented by jealous rivals and disgruntled former acquaintances. But Charles, armed with documented evidence and independent verification, remained unmoved by these protests, and eventually Edmund's composure crumbled entirely, revealing the desperate calculation beneath his polished exterior. "You cannot simply break this engagement," Edmund said, his voice rising with barely controlled panic. "The announcements have already been made. The scandal alone would damage both our families considerably, and I would remind you, Lord Camden, that certain financial arrangements were already discussed between our families in anticipation of this marriage. Any financial arrangements discussed will be honored appropriately according to the customs surrounding a broken engagement," Charles said firmly. "But I will not sacrifice my daughter's future happiness and security to a man whose own finances are considerably less stable than he has represented, and whose character, by multiple independent accounts, promises her nothing but continued unhappiness in the years ahead." Edmund's gaze shifted to Gideon, standing quietly but resolutely near the window, and his expression twisted with bitter understanding. "This is your doing," he said, his voice tight with fury. "You have poisoned this family against me for your own selfish purposes, Ravenswood, because you desire Earl'S for yourself. I have simply ensured that Lord Camden possesses complete and accurate information regarding a matter of considerable importance to his daughter's future," Gideon said calmly, though his eyes held none of their usual warmth when directed toward Edmund. "Whatever conclusions he has reached independently, through his own careful investigation. If those conclusions happen to align with certain feelings I hold toward Lady Earl'S, that is simply a matter of circumstance rather than manipulation." The confrontation ended with Edmund departing Camden House in a state of barely controlled rage, his engagement to Earl'S formally dissolved, his careful plans for securing his family's financial future through advantageous marriage collapsed entirely. Word of the broken engagement spread quickly through London society in the days that followed, exactly as Charles had anticipated, bringing considerable talk and speculation regarding the circumstances of its dissolution. But the scandal, as it turned out, proved considerably less damaging than Charles had feared, particularly once whispers began circulating regarding the true state of the Caro family finances and Edmund's documented history of difficult temperament. Information that seemed to spread through society's gossip networks with a speed and thoroughness that suggested certain interested parties had ensured its wide dissemination. Rather than viewing the broken engagement as a scandal reflecting poorly upon the Camden family, London society increasingly regarded it as a fortunate escape from a match that would have proven disastrous for Earl'S future happiness and security. In the weeks that followed the broken engagement, Gideon courted Earl'S properly, with her father's full blessing, in a manner considerably different from the calculated, business-driven approach that had characterized his initial presence in the Camden household. He escorted her to social gatherings openly, danced with her at balls without any pretense of hidden purpose, spent long afternoons in genuine, unguarded conversation that continued to deepen the connection first forged on a dark, foggy road months before. Earl'S found herself, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely excited about her future, rather than resigned to it as a matter of practical duty and family obligation. Every conversation with Gideon revealed new depths to his character, new evidence of the genuine warmth and consideration hidden beneath his fearsome public reputation. And she understood increasingly that the rumors that had followed him through London society, painting him as cold and merciless, had captured only a small, incomplete fraction of who he truly was. It was during a quiet evening walk through the Camden Gardens, nearly 2 months after the broken engagement, that Gideon finally asked the question that had been building between them since that first night on the dark, foggy road. "Earl'S," he said, stopping beneath the same old oak tree where they had shared so many honest conversations during the difficult weeks of her engagement to Edmund. "I have spent considerable time these past months trying to find adequate words to express what I feel toward you, and I find that plain, direct honesty has always served me better than elaborate speeches. I love you, entirely and without reservation, in a way I did not believe myself capable of feeling after everything I experienced during my years away. I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would agree to become my wife." Earl'S felt tears of genuine joy gathering in her eyes as she looked up at the man who had, against every expectation society had placed upon him, and against every careful wall she had once believed impossible to breach, become the center of her entire future. "Gideon," she said softly, "from the moment you appeared on that dark road, I sensed that you would change everything about my life, though I did not yet understand how completely or how wonderfully that would prove true. Yes, I will marry you, gladly and without any reservation." Their wedding, when it finally took place several months later, stood in stark contrast to the carefully calculated arrangement that had once been planned with Edmund Caro. The ceremony was held at Camden House, attended by family and genuine friends, rather than the wide circle of society connections Edmund had insisted upon, and Earl'S wore the pale blue silk she had originally chosen months before, the very fabric Edmund had once dismissed as unsuitable, now transformed into a gown that suited her perfectly, exactly as she had always known it would. As Gideon stood before the assembled guests, taking her hands in his own before the officiant, he spoke words that carried through the quiet garden where they had first confessed their honest feelings to each other, words that Earl'S would treasure for the remainder of her life. "There are those who have called me ruthless, cold, and merciless," he said, his gaze never leaving Earl'S face. "I do not entirely dispute those descriptions, for the years I spent in difficult circumstances shaped me in ways I cannot entirely undo. But I have learned, since returning home, that even a heart hardened by years of hardship can still recognize something precious when it appears before it, and can still fight fiercely to protect and claim that precious thing, regardless of the obstacles standing in its way. Earl'S Winters was never meant to be promised to another man, arranged and calculated according to practical benefit alone. She was meant to be claimed, fully and completely, by someone who recognized her true worth from the very first moment he encountered her, and I count myself the most fortunate man in England to be that someone." The garden erupted in warm applause as Gideon and Earl'S exchanged their final vows, sealing a union built not upon the calculated arrangements and practical benefits that had characterized her first engagement, but upon genuine love, mutual respect, and the kind of honest connection that had proven, in the end, considerably stronger than any obstacle society or circumstance had placed in their path. As they walked together from the garden as husband and wife for the first time, Earl'S glanced back briefly at the old oak tree where so many pivotal conversations had taken place, where fear and duty had gradually given way to honesty and courage, and felt profound gratitude for the broken carriage wheel that had, against all expectation, led her directly into the arms of the man who would spend the remainder of his life proving that even a wolf, once thought incapable of gentleness, could learn to love with a ferocity and devotion that surpassed anything she had ever imagined possible. Their marriage, in the years that followed, became something of a quiet legend within London society, a testament to the idea that genuine happiness sometimes required considerable courage to pursue, and that the paths carefully arranged by duty and practical calculation did not always lead to the destinations they promised. Charles Winters, watching his daughter's evident happiness in the years following her marriage to Gideon, never regretted the difficult decision to break her engagement to Edmund Caro, understanding, with the clarity that only time and observation could provide, that he had ultimately secured for his daughter something considerably more valuable than the practical financial security he had originally sought. Genuine, lasting happiness, built upon a foundation of honest love rather than calculated convenience. And Earl'S herself, in the quiet moments of reflection that came with the passing years, often found herself thinking back to that terrifying night on the dark, foggy road, when a broken carriage wheel had seemed like nothing more than an inconvenient misfortune, never imagining that it would prove, in time, to be the single most fortunate event of her entire life. Nearly a year into their marriage, when the household had settled into a comfortable rhythm and Earl'S had grown confident in her role as Duchess of Ravenswood, a new challenge arrived that neither she nor Gideon had anticipated. Edmund Caro, his pride still wounded, and his family's financial troubles having only worsened in the months since the broken engagement, had grown desperate enough to attempt something considerably more damaging than mere gossip. It began with a letter delivered to Gideon's shipping partners, claiming, falsely, that certain cargo manifests under Gideon's management had been deliberately falsified to avoid proper taxation, an accusation serious enough to threaten not only Gideon's business reputation, but his standing within Parliament itself. Earl'S learned of the accusation when she found her husband unusually quiet at breakfast one morning, a letter clutched tightly in his hand, his expression troubled in a way she had rarely seen since the difficult weeks before their wedding. "What has happened?" she asked, setting down her tea and reaching across the table to take his free hand. Gideon explained the accusation, and Earl'S felt a familiar surge of protective anger rise in her chest, recognizing immediately the bitter hand behind such a scheme. "Edmund," she said, not as a question but as certain knowledge. "I suspect as much," Gideon admitted, "though proving his involvement will require considerable care. False accusations of this nature can be difficult to unravel once they begin circulating, regardless of their ultimate falsity." But Earl'S, who had spent the past year learning a great deal about her husband's business affairs through genuine interest rather than idle curiosity, realized quickly that she possessed knowledge that might prove useful in defending against the accusation. She had, during quiet evenings spent reviewing shipping documents alongside Gideon, developed a clear understanding of exactly how the manifests were prepared and verified, understanding that would allow her to identify precisely where any falsification, had it actually occurred, would need to appear. "Let me help you review the documents," she said. "I have spent enough evenings studying your ledgers to know exactly what genuine records should show. If Edmund has fabricated evidence, there will be inconsistencies we can identify and expose." Gideon studied her with evident surprise and growing admiration, having perhaps forgotten, in the comfortable routine of their marriage, just how capable and intelligent his wife truly was beyond her role as a devoted companion. "Together then," he said, and together they spent the following days poring over shipping records, comparing them against the falsified claims that had reached Gideon's business partners, until they uncovered clear evidence that the accusations had been constructed using documents that did not match the genuine originals in several crucial details. Armed with this evidence, Gideon confronted his business partners directly, presenting the discrepancies clearly enough that any reasonable observer could see the accusations for the fabrication they truly were. He also, with Earl'S careful encouragement, took the additional step of tracing the falsified documents back to their source, discovering, through a clerk who had been bribed to provide access to genuine records for the purpose of creating convincing forgeries, clear evidence linking the scheme directly to Edmund Caro. Rather than pursuing the matter through public scandal, which might have satisfied a desire for revenge, but would have brought further unwanted attention to the entire situation, Gideon chose, instead, to confront Edmund privately, presenting him with the evidence of his scheme, and making clear that any further attempts to damage the Ravenswood family's reputation or business interests would result in formal legal action. With all the public consequences, such action would bring upon the already struggling Caro family name. Edmund, faced with the prospect of his scheme being exposed publicly, on top of his already precarious financial circumstances, had little choice but to abandon his campaign of quiet revenge entirely. He departed London shortly afterward, taking up residence at a distant family property, and Earl'S and Gideon heard little more of him in the years that followed beyond occasional, distant rumors of his continuing financial difficulties. The experience, difficult as it had been, ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the bond between Earl'S and Gideon, proving to both of them that their partnership extended far beyond simple romantic affection into genuine collaboration and mutual respect. Earl'S found herself increasingly involved in Gideon's business affairs in the months that followed, her sharp intelligence and careful attention to detail proving invaluable in matters he had once handled entirely alone, and Gideon, in turn, found himself relying on her judgment and counsel in ways he had never expected when he first embarked upon what he had told her father was purely a business venture. Their household grew steadily more lively over the following years, filled first with the arrival of a daughter, whom they named Charlotte in honor of Earl'S father, and later a son, whom Gideon insisted on naming after his own father, a decision that brought considerable emotion to a man rarely given to open displays of sentiment. Earl'S watched her husband transform, gradually and unmistakably, from the guarded, distant figure London society had once whispered about into a devoted father, whose fierce protectiveness toward his children matched the same intensity he had once directed toward securing Earl'S own happiness. Charles Winters, in the years following his daughter's marriage, became a frequent visitor to their household, delighting in his role as grandfather and often remarking, with evident satisfaction, that breaking Earl'S engagement to Edmund Caro remained the wisest decision of his entire life, regardless of the initial scandal and uncertainty it had brought upon the family. He and Gideon, once uneasy business partners bound together by convenient circumstance, developed over the years a genuine friendship built upon mutual respect and shared devotion to Earl'S happiness. London society, ever fickle in its judgments, gradually revised its opinion of the Duke of Ravenswood as well, the whispers of coldness and ruthlessness giving way, over time, to a grudging acknowledgement that whatever hardness the years of difficult service had instilled in him, it had clearly not extinguished a deeper capacity for genuine devotion and care. Gideon remained, in matters of business and public affairs, exactly as formidable and unyielding as his reputation had always suggested, a man not easily crossed or manipulated, but those who observed him within the privacy of his own household, laughing with his children in the garden or sharing quiet, affectionate conversation with his wife by the evening fire, understood that the wolf, as London had once called him, had found within his marriage to Earl'S Winters something considerably more valuable than the cold, solitary strength that had once defined him. Earl'S, for her part, never forgot the terrifying night on the dark, foggy road that had first brought Gideon into her life, and she often told the story to their children as they grew older, transforming what had once been a moment of genuine fear into a cherished family legend about the broken carriage wheel that had changed everything. She spoke, too, of the difficult weeks that had followed, of the courage it had taken to acknowledge her true feelings despite the weight of duty and family expectation pressing against her, and of the profound relief and joy that had come from finally choosing a future built upon genuine happiness rather than calculated obligation. Their story became, in time, a quiet testament within their own family, and among their closest friends to the idea that even the most carefully arranged futures could be reshaped by courage, honesty, and a willingness to fight for genuine happiness against considerable odds. Earl'S often reflected, in the peaceful years that followed the difficult beginning of her relationship with Gideon, that she had once believed her future entirely settled and unchangeable, bound irrevocably to a path she had not chosen for herself. It had taken a broken carriage wheel, a fierce and unexpected connection with a man the world called Ruthless, and the considerable courage to defy expectation and pursue genuine happiness, to teach her that even the most settled futures could still be transformed, given sufficient courage and the willingness to fight for what truly mattered. And so, in the quiet comfort of the life they built together, filled with genuine love, mutual respect, and the steady devotion that had grown from that first unexpected meeting on a dark and foggy road, Earl'S and Gideon Ashcroft found exactly the future they had once believed impossible. A life built not upon arrangement and obligation, but upon the fierce, unwavering love of a man once called a wolf, and the courage of a woman who had refused to remain forever promised to another.